Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the special Emory Alumni Association program. As you know, this historic election continues to shed light on who and how the American people vote and why. The Emory Alumni Latinx Network is delighted to be in conversation with Dr. Bernard Fraga, faculty with Emory College of Arts and Sciences. My name is Veronica Roman, mi familia de Puerto Rico. Shout out to some of them who are tuning into this webinar this evening. I am a graduate from both Oxford College in 2009 and from Emory College in 2011. And after I received an MED in College Student Affairs Administration at UGA, now I'm back at Oxford as the Associate Director for Student Involvement and Leadership in campus life. And last but not least, I'm here representing the Emory Atlanta Latinx Alumni Network as one of the two co-chairs. So before I jump into the program, I just want to cover a couple housekeeping items. This presentation will be recorded and sent to all registrants. And because this is a webinar format, you can see that the chat is disabled, but you'll still be able to submit questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. So please submit your questions so we can get them answered during the second part of this program. And of course, today I'm joined in conversation with Dr. Bernard Fraga, an accomplished political scientist whose research and teachings examine American electoral politics, racial ethnic politics, and mass and elite political behavior. As you know, he's an associate professor of political science at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Broadly speaking, Fraga is interested in how group identities and electoral contexts impact political behavior. His methodology tends toward the statistical analysis of historical and contemporary data associated with voter registration records and election results. He also conducts research on election law and electoral institutions in the United States. And Fraga has served as an expert consultant on multiple cases dealing with election law and voting rights. Fraga's 2018 book, The Turnout Gap: Race, Ethnicity, and Political Inequality in a Diversifying America, provides us a comprehensive analysis of race and voter turnout, examining America's four largest racial and ethnic groups and voting patterns from the 1800s to today. So this is why we've asked him to join us in conversation today. So like I said, please submit your questions using the Q&A feature so we can get them answered during the second part of this program. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fraga to share a bit about his background and interests, as well as his research on the current presidential election season. So Dr. Fraga, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Veronica, and thank you to the Emory Latinx Alumni Network and to everyone tuning in, affiliated with Emory or not. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, especially at this very, intense time. I don't have all the answers about what happened in 2020, but we're starting to get a picture, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments really in the second part of the talk. But I wanted to begin by giving you all a little bit of information from me. I am a new faculty member at Emory. I'm an associate professor. I earned tenure at Indiana University, which is where I was immediately prior to coming to Emory, and I'd been at Indiana since 2013. Before that, I did my PhD at Harvard in government and social policy, and did my undergraduate work at Stanford. So I don't have an Emory affiliation or a Southern affiliation myself, but again, I'm really happy to be here, especially in Atlanta, in Georgia, at such an important time for the state and really for the power of our community. So before I get into a little bit more about my research and what that can tell us about 2020, I also wanted to discuss some of my background and how it informed the way that I do research and the reasons why I do the research that I do. So I grew up in Indiana. I'm Mexican-American. I think it's third generation or something like that. My great-grandparents immigrated from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution into Texas. So I feel that Texas is like my kind of Latinx heritage place, a place that I went a lot when I was younger. But I grew up in Indiana in a very, isolated kind of place without many Latinx people around. Where the community, although it's growing now, was relatively small at the time, near South Bend, near the University of Notre Dame. And when I was going to school there, one of the things that I really noticed beyond the lack of diversity was the fact that when people talked about politics, it was a very divided place. It was a place with relatively equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans at the time. It's leaning a little bit more Republican now, like much of the Midwest. But politics was very much a part of a transition that was going on in Indiana towards the Republican Party from the Democratic Party. Really a transition that later on, 10 to 15 to 20 years later, really made a lot of sense to me in terms of what we saw in terms of Trump's appeal. But when I was in high school, I was interested in politics, maybe because of growing up in that environment. I worked at the polls in 2003, and actually one of the very first elections where we saw the implementation of some suppressive voter tactics. And even though the place I grew up was not very diverse, I could see things like the early forms of voter identification laws being used to prevent some elderly people who had registered to vote and voted for decades from voting. So really, I mean, this is in junior and senior year of high school, really started thinking about the electoral process as something that had an impact on people's lives where not everyone was able to participate. Then going to college at Stanford, fall semester, fall quarter, I worked on the one of the presidential campaigns in 2004. Obviously, it was a time of a lot of, for all of you who remember, a lot of unrest, a lot of people who were very upset about the direction of our government. If only we knew how things would change, 12 years later. But I worked on that campaign, which is not successful. I don't have to tell you which one, you can guess. And then worked as a poll worker in California in 2005. And again, that was another instance where I saw the impact on our community specifically, because where I was in Northern California, one of the few counties in the nation, although most in California have this, where Spanish language access was provided to all voters as part of the Voting Rights Act. And the elderly poll workers, all of whom were Democrats, by the way, that I worked with, were just, could not believe that anyone would show up needing to speak Spanish, needing to use Spanish language materials in order to vote. They said that's un-American. And it just made me think a lot about, the place of our community and how I had so much wanted to be in a more diverse college environment, and yet was still dealing with the kind of, the kind of ways of thinking about our community as not really being part of America, not belonging to this country that really, it really impacted me at the time. I was involved in student government and involved in a number of student organizations related to our community. We had a MetChat chapter at at Stanford, and that was another area where I saw the power of our community that we could have if we worked together. I got involved with student government elections actually, and that might not seem to matter much, but at Stanford, all of the student organization funding had to be put up to vote by the student body. So those elections were how each of the racial ethnic community organizations got their funding for the year. And the year before I got there, the Latinx community, the Chicano Latino community at the time, had actually lost in a very narrow vote. The student body voted down their funding, so they actually didn't get any funding to do any events. The university pitched in some, but it was that was a big moment. So I saw again the importance of elections for our community. And all of this is just to say that, the coursework in my experience as an undergraduate, taking political science classes, but also classes in Chicano Latino studies, classes in African American studies, and comparative studies of race and ethnicity, anthropology and sociology, in addition to political science and political theory, really shaped my understanding of the world and the power that we could have. And during the time that I was there, in my senior year in college is when, Obama ran in the primary. And then in the fall, when I started graduate school, that's when, he won in the November election in 2008. And it was a moment of really the culmination of a lot of efforts that community organizations, especially in the Black community, had done, but also a moment where I thought I could see what could happen if our community, turned out to vote and really participated at the high rates that African Americans had. Maybe even if we had a Latino candidate running for office, him or herself, maybe that would be, a moment for our community too. So, it's kind of funny that I'm giving you that trajectory to show two things. One is how much things kind of changed, how, for our current students at Emory that I've interacted with, not as much as I'd like to, of course, given the pandemic, but that I've interacted with, the current events really shape their worldview, and the Trump administration and this election really shapes the view that students are going to have about what they're interested in and why the community matters for a long time to come. And maybe it impacted your sense of community as well. But also because I really found a way to tie my research into all the experiences that I had and my sense of self in America as a person of Latinx ancestry, as a Mexican American, as a Chicano, in American society, I'm really glad that my research can tie into that. So that's a little bit about myself, but now I want to talk about my research and tie it into the 2020 election. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Okay. Let's see. Get this out. Okay, I think everyone can see my screen, I hope. So I'm going to be presenting some work from my research and talking a little bit about my recent book as well to give some kind of framing for this. So as I mentioned before, when we think about the 2020 election, I think the big takeaway, which now is not news to most of you because you've seen the headlines, but we knew it, I would say the day after the election, is the fact that, Joe Biden won. And in one of the rare instances in American history, in the history of presidential elections, an incumbent president was defeated after running for re-election. It's very rare. That hasn't happened very often. And given, the results of the 2018 election, which were seen as really pushing back against the Trump administration, many of the policies, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, the way coronavirus has impacted our communities, that has a role to play as well. But in historically high voter turnout, Donald Trump was defeated, and he will not be the president on late January, early February 2021, no matter what the efforts that he's putting forward are. So that's the important first takeaway to keep in mind, and I tell my students that too. The second thing is that I'm speaking to you from Atlanta, Georgia, from Emory, not far from Emory's campus. And Georgia flipping blue for the first time since 1992 is a historic moment in many ways, but I think it's a historic moment for communities of color, especially. Certainly the growing Latinx population plays a role in Georgia flipping blue, but also I think it's important to note the fact that for the first time ever, or at least since Reconstruction, but the first time in Georgia certainly, we have, and in modern history, a non-white racial and ethnic group was a majority of the winning candidates coalition. That is, African Americans were 60% of the Democratic voters that made it so Joe Biden won the state. That's never happened before, at least since Reconstruction. There was a complicated era for a number of reasons. Happy to take questions about it. African Americans alone, by themselves, were 60% of the coalition for Biden. And so, the power of communities of color in this election, I think, really reflects a trend that we, have been talking about as social scientists for a long time, which is the growing diversification of the United States and the power that minority voters, that voters of color can have if participating in the electoral process. And so, that really makes us reflect on the transformation that we've seen. And this motivates most of my work, is really talking about how our nation is diversified and the implications for politics, not just our politics as communities, but the impact we can have on the national conversation. So, when talking about the civil rights movement, the civil rights era in the 1960s, when we gained many of the rights that we enjoy today, and the African American community and Asian Americans did as well, we have to keep in mind that America was a very different place. The United States was only 15% non-white, or what today we classify as non-white, Black, Latinx, Asian American, Native American, multiracial perhaps, in 1960. But in 2020, the census is likely to show that 40% of the US population is non-white. Now, that's not news to most of you, but the fact that this diversification has come mostly from the growth of the Latinx and Asian American population, especially the Latinx population, which will already does make up the largest non-white single racial and ethnic group, depending on how you define that, but the largest non-white racial and ethnic group in the country today, really means that the US has changed a lot since even the mobilization that we saw of communities of color in the 1960s. And so when we talk about race and ethnicity in the US, we cannot avoid talking about the Latinx community, even in a place like Georgia, even in the South, and even despite the fact that we always need to be cognizant of the power of African American voters, the need for African American voters to really shape their own destiny here and elsewhere in the country. So I study voter turnout. That's something I've been focused on quite a bit recently, and something that I'm actively exploring now for helping to understand the 2020 election. So much of my research has focused on voter turnout, voter participation. And I'm motivated to study this in particular because despite the diversification that we've seen, there are still disparities, racial and ethnic disparities in who turns out to vote. Quickly, this chart shows trends in the rate of voter turnout going from the 1940s to 2016. We don't have great 2020 data yet that's comprehensive nationwide on rates of voter turnout. But we know that over time, turnout for the non-Hispanic white population has decreased but has stayed, for the most part, higher than turnout for example, African Americans. And historically, African American turnout was far lower than white turnout. We know that because of voter suppression, but really voter disenfranchisement, often de jure voter disenfranchisement in southern states like Georgia. It increased substantially after and during the civil rights movement and stabilized maybe around 60% of eligible African Americans voting, increasing through the 2000s, culminating in the 2012 election where survey data suggests that Black turnout exceeded white turnout for the first time in history. But if we add in Latinx voter turnout, which we don't have going back quite as far in time, we see a different story, which is that Latinx turnout has never been higher than white turnout, certainly, but also is substantially lower than African American turnout. Again, after accounting for the large number of Latinxes who are under 18 and the fact that a large percent of our population is non-citizen. This is just among adult citizens who are eligible to vote. We still see dramatically lower Latinx voter turnout. Now, in 2008, right, a historic election, I mentioned it before, very influential for thinking about what I wanted to study. We still saw, despite outreach efforts from President Obama, Latinx voter turnout being significantly lower than turnout of African Americans and the white population. And if we talk about Asian Americans, we see a similar trend, right? The fastest growing racial and ethnic group in the country, also very low rates of voter turnout. So when I do my research, when I study the Latinx population, I try and put it in context. I try and think about our community in context with other racial and ethnic groups, a theme that you'll see later on when I talk about 2020. So a big motivating question for my work, why do we still see low turnout for some racial and ethnic groups? And this is really the topic of my book, The Turnout Gap. Those disparities, those gaps in racial ethnic rates of voter turnout between minority groups and whites, why do they persist despite nominally at least, right, equal access to the ballot box for all Americans? Really quickly, I want to run through the kind of major arguments here. One is we can talk about long-standing socioeconomic differences between people of color and whites. That's certainly important, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic that has disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. We can also talk about that history that I mentioned of discrimination and frankly, de jure, that is by law, voting restrictions on African Americans, but also Latinxes and Asian Americans. And in some ways that can also be kind of turned on its head. It can be a motivating force. Maybe one reason why Black turnout is so high is because African Americans realize the power of the vote, given that literally blood was shed, including in Georgia and Alabama and other states, right? Blood was shed here in order to ensure African Americans had the right to vote. We can also talk about contemporary voter suppression, something that many political scientists are actively exploring. And we saw signs of this even in the 2020 election. In places like Texas, the governor of Texas, shortly before early voting started, limited the amount of ballot drop-off boxes to 1 per county, which disproportionately impacted the Latinx population, which is concentrated in heavily populated counties like Harris County, where Houston is, one of the largest counties in the nation. We can even talk about that in Georgia, the very long line seen in the June primary. Many people were worried there would be a repeat for the November election. But what I focus on in the book is a deeper story that is in fact harder to deal with and to study, the lack of engagement and mobilization with minority communities. And frankly, the fact that there are few incentives, and the incentives that exist are not aligned with the mobilization of people of color. That is, despite the diversification of the United States, most of the time, the incentive exists to mobilize white voters. Now, how can that be true given the tremendous diversification of our country? Well, I didn't show that entire chart. Despite the fact that the US has become more diverse, non-Hispanic whites still make up the vast majority of the population in the country. So in most elections and in most places, the incentive still exists to mobilize the white population instead of minority communities, together or separately. Now, in 2020, many identified Biden as having a challenge, an opportunity as well, but a challenge in trying to mobilize minority voters. And that was traded off with, again, mobilizing the non-Hispanic white population, those swing voters, those white suburban voters that we hear so much about. And this is an interesting kind of trade-off to make, given the fact that we know that despite the existence of white swing voters, the vast majority of the white population, including white women, even young whites, voted for President Trump in 2016. So what's changed for the 2020 election? First, Latinxes are now the largest non-white racial and ethnic group in the eligible voter population. Approximately 2/3 of the US eligible voter, that is adult citizen voting age population, is white, 13.6% is Latinx, 13.5% is African American, so just smaller, 5% is Asian. So Latinx voters could have more power if they were mobilized. And in the primaries, we saw some efforts to do that by Bernie Sanders' campaign, although it fell short, he wasn't able to win the primary. Happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Second, half of Latinxes in the US are under the age of 27. The Latinx population is a young population in the US. So when we think about the impact of age on voter turnout, young people less likely to vote than older people, that also disproportionately impacts our community. In fact, 4.5 million Latinx citizens were too young to vote in 2016, but could vote this year. So 4.5 million Latinxes had to be mobilized to vote for the first time in this election cycle. No other group has numbers like that. And we can go further back. Half of Latinx eligible voters this year were too young to vote in the 2008 election, in that historic election with Barack Obama. So again, when we talk about the Latinx voter population, it's a young and dynamic and diverse population. Now, in 2020, the big question of what happened when we're post-election is the possibility that a substantial number of Latinos or Hispanics voted for President Trump. So what happened with the Latinx vote? Now, most of you are probably tired of this. I was tired of it before the election, but it's important to note that Latinxes are not a monolith, that we're not one single community with a shared history. Now, African Americans aren't either, non-Hispanic whites certainly aren't, but the diversity that we have in our community means there's going to be variation in political preferences. Looking at the numbers, 60% are Mexican origin, 10% are Puerto Rican, and 5% are Cuban of the eligible voter population, once again. So dominated by Mexicans and Mexican Americans, but with a sizable Puerto Rican population and Cuban population too. We talk about other groups, Central Americans together are 10%, 6% are South American together, and 5% are Dominican. No group is larger than Cubans or Dominicans independently, so they're bunched together there. And today, 50% of Latinxes are US-born Mexican Americans. That's another important point to make, is that the experience of most, well, a bare majority of Latinxes in the US is US-born Mexican Americans. And in places like Texas, the Latinx eligible population is 86% of Mexican origin. Florida, one of the more diverse states, even there, Cubans are not the whole story. Less than a third are Cuban, and everyone forgets about the Puerto Rican population in Florida, which is growing dramatically due to, the economic crises and climate crises on the island, right? A very, very large share of the Latinx population is Puerto Rican too. Smaller for other groups. Mexicans are actually the third largest group in Florida. So that diversity is a strength of our community in many ways, but means there's going to be political variation. And the news has picked up on this, saying Democrats missed the fact that Trump appealed to Latino voters. Quickly hear the idea that liberals don't understand pro-Trump Latinos, that they're actually more interested in anti-communism and really reject socialist rhetoric championed by Latinxes like AOC in some ways. Others say we just need to accept the fact that some Latinos are going to vote Republican because they're Republican naturally. And I think that's an important viewpoint to hear as well. But if we look at places like South Texas, a historically Democratic area, we can see that the on-the-ground work that Trump was doing, talking about the economy and jobs, really was not replicated by Democrats, at least this year. Now, the facts on the 2020 Latinx vote are a lot less discouraging than the news headlines would make you think. Because if we look across states, the vast majority, even in Florida, of Latinxes stated that they were going to vote for Joe Biden. Even in Florida, right, nearly 60% said that they were going to vote for Joe Biden in the 2020 election. Only 38% said that they were going to vote for Donald Trump. Say like Georgia, 69 to 28%. A little bit closer to Florida, but still vast majority, over 2/3, saying they'll vote for Joe Biden. And if we look at cross-national origin group, with the exception of Cuban Americans, across that national origin diversity, yeah, we're not a monolith, but we kind of vote heavily Democratic across groups. Again, except for Cuban Americans, but even their substantial share vote Democratic. So I'm running out of time here, but I just want to compare briefly our voting patterns to that of other groups, like those white swing voters who voted disproportionately again for Donald Trump, including white women who voted disproportionately for Donald Trump in this election, just like in 2016. So I think that this election, we really need to think about it as a kind of warning sign to Democrats that can't take the Latino vote for granted. They need to work on their mobilization tactics and make sure that our community is represented, not just on election day or the weeks before, but really throughout the year, beyond elections, make sure that our community's needs are being listened to by politicians. I also think we need to pay more attention to the future generations, because a lack of mobilization that's happening now might mean lower turnout for this growing segment of the millennial and Gen Z population too. Okay, I've gone way over the time that I planned, but I'm looking forward to your questions and feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fraga. This is a lot to digest for me. For everyone, we're now transitioning into the discussion portion of the program. So those that are watching can continue sending in questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom. You spoke to what you referred to as contemporary voter suppression. And one of the questions was, does language barrier fall under that category? So language barrier at the polls specifically, does that prohibit some from voting? What is your understanding of what the language barrier is when it comes to actually showing up at the polls?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And as I mentioned in my introductory comments, right, it's something that really influenced a lot of my early thinking for why I wanted to study, Latinx voter turnout in particular, but really racial ethnic disparities in turnout. So even though much of the Voting Rights Act has been kind of, how do you put it, removed from play, right, really gutted, as a result of the Shelby v. Holder decision, which also is related to broader efforts at voter suppression. Some of the provisions that are still in force make sure that in places with a large concentration of non-English dominant eligible Latinx voters, they can get Spanish language voting assistance. The entire state of California, entire state of Texas, Arizona, Florida as well have those language protections in place, those language provisions, the Section 203 provisions in place. And that's very important for ensuring that our community's voice can be heard, even if it's in Spanish. So I do think that there is, in some ways, we could talk about voter suppression in terms of the campaigns not doing enough Spanish language outreach, not paying attention to Spanish dominant Latinxes. But in terms of people actually trying to vote, in most of the places where our community really, has the power to shape election outcomes, there are Spanish language materials available. Now, again, whether election officials make it clear that you can do that, that's another question. They're supposed to. I found some evidence in my own research that it's kind of 50-50, but at very least, right, this is something that community organizations can tap into to make sure that every Latinx person who wants to vote can, even in Spanish.
So considering then the Latinx vote, what impact did it have on our swing states in this particular election?
Yeah, this is a great question, right? So first, if we take the broad look at what a swing state is, right, and we include certainly Florida, that's a perennial swing state, but also Texas, right, an emerging swing state that in the polls was like 50-50 for a little bit. Both of those states went for Trump, right? And the story that people tell there is, well, it was Cuban-American voters in Miami-Dade that turned out for Clinton, but didn't turn out for Biden, right? They got scared off by the kind of socialist rhetoric. It was really Trump campaign emphasizing that. So I think that's an important part of the story. In South Texas, as I mentioned before, Republicans had been making outreach efforts to more conservative, rural Latinx populations, Mexican-American populations there for some time. It seemed to have paid off. But another swing state, Arizona, which didn't go for Hillary in 2016, but almost did, this year flipped to Biden, in large part because of increased mobilization of Latinx communities in Arizona, spurred on by the anti-immigrant efforts, right, of Republicans in that state that have been going on for a decade or more. So I think that shows the power of our community, Arizona does, for shaping outcomes that positively impact our community.
And you started to touch on this population in particular, but someone in our audience identified as a Venezuelan, and they're frustrated by the fact that many Cubans and Venezuelans are so against socialism that they'd vote for someone who's closer to some of the experiences that they've had. So do you have any understanding of the rationale behind that, and what would push them to it's like, what are the optics with that trigger word socialism, and what is the weight around that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. for the Venezuelans, for the Venezolanos in the audience, right? Congratulations, this is your moment kind of in the spotlight, because I've seen more headlines and more commentators talking about Cubans and Venezuelans than ever before. And it's
Mm,
important to note, I mean, Venezuelans are, as you probably know, a relatively small share of the population, even in Florida, of the Latinx population, not to mention the national Latinx population or the broader Florida electorate. But I think because of, the experience and, the growth in the kind of, I mean, we could say refugee population from Venezuela, right? Given the crisis that's going on there politically, I think that, it deserves attention, right? For thinking about connections with Cuban Americans.
mm,
Now, the way the question was framed about, Trump being closer to Maduro or Chavez even than the kind of anti-socialist or anti-communist rhetoric the Trump campaign was using would imply is fascinating, because that's exactly the message Democrats were trying to get out in Florida. The message they were trying to get out, because I know my friends were doing a lot of this work, right? Colleagues of mine from college, was that, Trump is a caudillo, right? Like a strongman, a Latin American style strongman, right? Sure, he talks about anti-socialism and anti-communism, but he's like a dictator,
mm,
right? Like Maduro, right? Like Castro, right? Like Fidel and his brother. So it's interesting that that didn't play well. It didn't seem to stick. But I think when you talk about Spanish language media, the power of the Republican Party in South Florida in general, they're feeling like this is a moment where they could really take back some control after some big losses for Cuban American Republican candidates in 2016. I think it was kind of a perfect storm where that message really played well with not just Cubans and Venezuelans in Florida, but other Latinx communities there too.
mm. Great. Um, these questions are in no particular order. I'm just kind of going with how they've come in.
Sure.
One of the questions is about the data that you provided. So you said that voter turnout before, I think it was 1968. We just don't know how Latinx population showed up before that time. And why is that? What is that attributed to?
People weren't paying attention to us.
Mm,
I mean, that's really, it's an interesting part of the story. I mean, there's a whole, social scientists have done some work on this, on, the emergence of Hispanic as a category of study. Sorry, my son is in the background crying. The era of Zoom, right? This is the way it works. But, you know, well, two things. One is our population was, relatively small. I didn't mention this specifically in statistics, but the Latinx population in the U.S., or we'd later call Latinxes or Hispanics, Spanish-speaking was a term that was used in the 1960s and 1970s to talk about a community, was only about 3.5%, I think, in the 1960 census, right?
mm,
3.5% of the population. And so it was difficult to measure, right, in some ways. People weren't really paying attention. But it's really the activism and the Chicano movement and other movements that were going on in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the growth of our population too, that led to the government, starting to record this information. And frankly, the efforts of the African-American community to secure civil rights, we jumped on the bandwagon. And in many ways, the exposure that our community has now and the fact that there are statistics about us, about our rates of voter turnout, but also about things like poverty and the challenges our communities face, is really thanks to the activism, frankly, our community too, but really of African Americans in pushing for, broader racial justice. So we
mm.
have a lot to thank to African American leaders at that time for making our community's voice heard.
Yes, we do. In terms of your research with how messages are getting out to Latinx populations, does your research or any of your colleagues' research take into account how Univision and Telemundo affect political perceptions at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of research about Spanish language media and the impact that it has. And I got to tell you, a lot of it is mixed, right? Some of it says that, when candidates use Spanish language advertising or media, that it actually, can depress turnout in our communities, that it doesn't seem to activate voters in the way that we would think. And some of that is because the vast majority of Latinx voters, or the people who actually vote, are English dominant or at least are bilingual, right?
Mm,
And for the few in our community where, who are bilingual, but it's very symbolic, right? And I consider myself to be part of this population where I like seeing candidates, appeal in Spanish because it means our community's voice is being heard. I'm voting anyway, right? and I'm voting one direction anyway. So like, it doesn't really change my mind or make me more likely to vote because I'm already very likely to vote.
Right,
So
right.
for people on the margins, it doesn't work.
Mm,
But I will say that um, the engagement with Spanish language media, certainly, but also Spanish language, TV, but also Spanish language radio is really kind of an untapped resource by many campaigns. The national campaigns understand that they should do that. But for example, here in Georgia, not seeing the kind of all hands on deck effort by the Democratic candidates for Senate in the runoff to appeal to the growing Latinx population with Spanish language media. It's really a missed opportunity, I feel like. A missed opportunity also because the family members, even if they're not eligible to vote, if they're immigrants, right, whatever their status, will tell their children who might
mm,
be just old enough to vote or are aging into the electorate, that these are candidates that are paying attention to our community and to the issues that they care about. So I think that the dividends that we see in terms of Spanish language media can't just be understood in the short term where it's more mixed, but really longer term in terms of telling our community not only that we matter around election time, but that someone's paying attention to our issues more broadly. So I'd like to see politicians use Spanish language media much more heavily outside of the electoral context as well.
mm. And you mentioned you just did this with the R issues. So, what are those primary political issues that are driving the Latinx population to vote?
Yeah, I mean, these are good questions. They're tough questions, right? If I had all the answers, then I'd be like Chuck Rocha or like one of the other like high paid, Latinx consultants that's out there now. But I will
Maybe,
say that I agree with, go ahead.
maybe one day is what I was.
Maybe one day. I'm going to stay in the classroom, I think. Uh, so it's funny because I will, agree with Chuck here. Chuck Rocha was one of Bernie Sanders' main advisors. And I think what we learned from the Sanders campaign is that our community cares about a lot of the same things that other communities of color and other communities more broadly care about: education, jobs, right? Julian Castro, who ran for president as well, I mean, he understood that too. It's not that our community only, we care about immigration, that's very important, right? Given the demographics that I showed, the large share that are US born, we care about immigration too, right? It's important. It's a very symbolic and substantive issue for many people in our community. But it's about education, it's about jobs. This year it's about COVID, right? It's just that people aren't talking to us. They're not
Mm,
talking to us about those issues in a way that talks about the context that we live in, right? And I think we saw this in South Texas. It's not that Joe Biden didn't have a jobs platform or the Democrats don't care about economic growth. It's just that the Republicans were on the ground talking about that message, right? They said things like the Democrats are going to take away the oil jobs in South Texas, right? Now, Biden could have come in with his campaign and gone around and done messaging and said, we're not going to take away the oil jobs, but he didn't. He wasn't on the ground in South Texas.
mm,
In some ways, he took the vote for granted. So I think that, the issues that our community faces they're not a shock, right? It's not surprising. We care about a lot of the same things that, every community cares about. And frankly, the millennial generation
mm,
and Gen Zers have viewpoints that are very much aligned with Gen Z and millennial African Americans, right? There's a real affinity, coalition potential there. It's just no one's talking to our communities in the way that they need to, or at least as much as they really should.
mm, mm. This is a little bit of a pivot, but you talked a little bit in your presentation about how natural disasters impact voter turnout, and specifically with Hurricane Maria and Puerto Riqueños. So, is there any evidence that the enormous relief package to Puerto Rico had an impact on how they voted in this election?
Well, it's funny, we were talking about understudied populations, despite the fact that people in Florida understand that the Puerto Rican community has grown tremendously, right? And probably, within the next 5 years will be the largest Latinx, I guess, national origin group in Florida, right? The data on Puerto Rican voting trends or issues that are important is sparse, right? Really, almost doesn't exist. The limited data that we have says rates of voter turnout in 2016 also, but in 2018 and this year were far lower than for Cuban Americans, far lower than predicted. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that even though Puerto Ricans are citizens by birth, right, in Puerto Rico as well, things like changing residency and getting registered to vote are real barriers to Puerto Rican participation, right?
Mm,
But, to me, again, it's a story of politicians just not paying attention to the community, even though they really should. And I was optimistic that there would be more efforts. I know the people on the ground in Florida, and they understood the power of the Puerto Rican community there, but I think it just got swamped by frankly, the campaign's effort to swing Cuban American voters that were just a prime target for Trump. Maybe it would have made more sense, sorry to the Venezolanos out there, but instead of talking about Venezolanos, to talk about Puerto Ricanos, right? Talk about a larger population that are, again, citizens by birth that, right, suffered tremendously under the Trump administration, right? And his response efforts to natural disasters in Puerto Rico, to earthquakes and everything as well, right? So, it's interesting to think about, even within our community, right? There's not always the appropriate balance in terms of attention paid.
Mm-hmm. This question is more about like the cultural implications of voting. So I think there's a I don't know if it's a stereotype or an understanding that Latinx families vote the same way, whereas non-Latinx families have different voting patterns within the same household. Does any of your research touch on like the family influences and values, and how that might implicate or cause implications on voter turnout?
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, one of these really key questions. And, for anyone, again, I'll just say this now because, we're running short on time. To anyone who has more questions or wants to talk more about research, I'm happy to communicate via email, or when the pandemic is over, if you're in the Atlanta area, too, like I'd love to, to set up a meeting. But, one thing two things I'll say about voter turnout and the family. We know how important family is in our community, other communities too, of course, but family is very, very important for, Latinx Americans, right? And the broader, Latin American population in the world too. We know that family is very important as well in terms of the immigration experience. And we know that, our political experience is shaped not only for those of us that are immigrants, but also for those of us that are descended from immigrants. And that immigrant experience really impacts our view of America, of our place in America, and the role that we should play. So one thing that, social scientists have looked at with the Latinx population in particular is the kind of reverse generational pattern you see for whites, which is that younger Latinxs who are born in the United States are influencing the politics and the behavior, including the turnout behavior of their parents who are, for example, recently naturalized, right? So it's like a reverse, like a bottom-up kind of thing, right? And so again, how important younger Latinx populations are, the first generation born in the US really is, for influencing the politics of their parents. Right? I think that's really key. Also for serving, as we talked about language barriers, as translators, right? But really interpreters of American politics, and helping, our parents and our abuelos understand, right? The politics in the US, who they should be paying attention to. What is Trump trying to say? What is Trump going to do to us? That often falls on the shoulders of, even, young people under the age of 18 who aren't yet eligible to vote, who are, again, interpreting politics, right? But we know that in Texas and in South Florida are two great examples of the reverse pattern too, where families that in Texas have historically voted Democrat, right? Young people, I think, we don't have clear data on this, are driving the shift to Trump, which is scary to think about for the future in many ways, right? But it's not the older people, it's the younger Latinxs, right? Who are driving the shift to Trump, who are rejecting their parents' kind of, the Democratic Party is the only game in town. And in Florida, young people were supposed to be the kind of vanguard, right? That's influencing their parents, right? That's shifting them from traditionally Republican to Democrat. It seems like this year it didn't really work so well. So even within the family, that back and forth between the young generation and the old generation can play out in kind of interesting and counterintuitive ways.
I love that. And we're almost up on time. One thing that I want to make sure we get answered is that, aside from, educating our own families and ourselves, what are other effective strategies or tactics you've seen to promote Latinx voter turnout? Like, what could we do as a community?
Well, I think, what we can do as a community is, first of all, be a community, right? We can work together. The more that we understand, in all this discussion of Latinx is not a monolith. This year, the response of many people outside of our community has been, there is no Latinx community, right? We don't exist, right? Instead, we should be talking about Mexican Americans, and then divide that into Mexicans and, who are foreign born, and Mexican Americans who are native born. It's been to divide us up. And we know divide and conquer is a strategy that's been very effective, in the political world and, it's scary to think that that could be playing out not just in, for Republicans, right? But, for Democrats and Democratic kind of political leaders as well, saying that our community doesn't really exist, so therefore we don't deserve attention.
Mm, mm,
That's a frightening thing. So I think it's working together and showing that despite our differences, right, there's a lot of commonality, and that we should really, be understood as a powerful potential block of voters with a lot of shared interests. The other thing is to support organizations that are from our community, that are doing work in our community. So in politics, one big barrier, and we see this in Georgia right now, is that people from outside of Georgia come in to try and say, here's how you should mobilize Latinxes. We have
mm,
Latinx leaders in this state, right? We have Latinx leaders in this state who, have done tremendous work that deserve our attention and deserve our support. So support those organizations
mm.
in the metro area and outside that are working to mobilize our community and making sure our community is empowered.
Mm, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. Thank you, all the attendees that joined us today. It means a lot to have you engage with us in this capacity, especially around this conversation that is so timely. And this conversation does not end here. All the registrants will actually be invited to continue this conversation through Emory Civic Dinners. So Emory Civic Dinner is an opportunity to bring the Emory community together through conversation to foster dialogue, unite people, and inspire action in groups, in small groups, about 8 to 10 people. So that's an opportunity that will come your way. And then if you're interested in connecting with Dr. Fraga, he has shared that he is willing to continue the conversation. And also connecting with the Emory Latinx Alumni Association, you can visit alumni.emory.edu. So that's if you want to connect with the Emory Alumni Network. So thank you all again. I so appreciate your participation in this, Dr. Fraga. It was such a pleasure to engage with you in this conversation.
Thank you all so much for your great questions, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.